Thanks for joining our U.S. foreign policy class here in Mexico. I wanted to discuss three topics: 9/11, the economy, and World War III scenario within our time. Um, just to start off, I saw a comment you mentioned how even eighth graders are beginning to contact you now. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, well, let's see if I can remember that.
It's for a documentary, you said.
It was an eighth grade class that last year won a C-SPAN contest. C-SPAN is an American television network that covers important public debates and things like that. And they won some award for their documentary. And they were trying to win again, and they contacted me on the subject of jobs offshoring. That is the movement of American manufacturing and professional service jobs to countries where the cost of the work is lower in order to maximize American corporate profits and returns to shareholders. So I was astonished that eighth graders were aware of this issue when I've had no success whatsoever in making the American economics profession aware of the issue, or the media, that is, not the internet media, of course, but what's called the mainstream media, the print and TV media, or even the policymakers in Washington, among whom I used to be paramount, or the Wall Street Journal, where I was the associate editor. But these eighth graders were aware, and they knew it was affecting them. So I saw that as a very astonishing and hopeful development. And I agreed to this, and they made this documentary, and I was interviewed by this very young, I'm not sure you could say it was a young woman. It was a child in transition between being a child and a young woman. And I was quite astonished at the awareness that the class gave me of their being sensitive to what was affecting their future.
I wanted to read a closing paragraph from one of your recent articles. You say, "The only advice I can give is that when you hear the media smear a concern or explanation as conspiracy theory, have a closer look. The divergence between what is happening and what you are told is so vast that it pays to be suspicious, cynical even, of what your government and your media, prostitute media, tell you. The chances are high that it is a lie." We talked about 9/11 towards the end of the semester, and the class said it was a good idea. Based on the evidence, all of them either believe that the U.S. administration allowed it to happen or deliberately executed the operation. So as the years pass, I see more people coming to logical conclusions. And so a lot of them seem stuck between the administration letting it happen and knowing about it, or them actually executing it. Can you give a brief comment on how you might sway them using the evidence? Which way?
Well, first of all, let me say that I am merely a reporter of the evidence collected by distinguished scientists, international scientists, by 2,000 high-rise architects and structural engineers, by 100 first responders and firefighters who were on the scene in the buildings, and by hundreds of American pilots, both commercial airline pilots, people who have been pilots for their entire careers, and American fighter jet pilots. And so I am familiar with what they say, what they've found, and what they've concluded. And it's conclusive. And I have added to this my own perspective as a former high policymaker, both in the administration and in Congress, where I was a staff member of important committees with uh, high secret, top secret security clearances dealing with the national security of the United States. And I've added then to the evidence from experts my own experience that the national security state of the United States cannot, under any circumstances, be defeated by a few Saudi Arabians operating independently of any government and any intelligence service. It's strictly impossible. It couldn't happen. And if such a thing happened, the screams and yells from the White House, from Congress, from the media for an explanation of how the American national security state could totally fail all across the board simultaneously. NORAD, the National Security Council, not just the CIA and the FBI, but all 16 American intelligence agencies, all intelligence agencies of America's NATO allies, including Israel's Mossad, which has penetrated all of these movements. That how airport security could fail 4 times in the same hour on the same morning, how air traffic control could fail, how the United States Air Force, for the first time in history, could not get fighter interceptors into the air. There's no way this could happen. It's totally impossible. So, despite all of the hard evidence that has come in from scientists and architects and engineers and lifelong pilots, both military and commercial, and the firefighters in the towers, who themselves, there are over 100 of these people who say, we personally witnessed explosions in the sub-basements prior to the airliners hitting the buildings. Despite all this evidence, just what I know, the story is preposterous. It couldn't happen. It's beyond a James Bond movie. And so to say that the government knew it and allowed it to happen, it couldn't have happened. Nobody can do this. How could the Saudis have had access to the buildings, 3 buildings, to wire them with explosives so that they self-destruct in a controlled demolition? It's just not possible. So this clearly was some sort of an inside job. We'll never know who did it. In the United States, there are a lot of powerful black op operations. They were spawned during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union was seen to be a dangerous threat to existence of the Western world. And these budgets are secret. Even when I had authority over the budget of the United States as a chief economist for the Committee on the Budget, House of Representatives, we weren't permitted to know these budgets. And no one knows them. The president doesn't know them. I'm not even sure the CIA director knows them. So these organizations exist, and they can do whatever they want. They're funded in ways that no one knows, or there's no accountability. They don't report to anybody. So we don't really know. We'll never find out, because the people who raise the questions, even distinguished scientists, most of the work was done by this nanochemist in Copenhagen, University of Copenhagen. He's not got any axe to grind in the United States. He's the one who has reported finding reacted and unreacted nanothermite in the dust of the two Twin Towers. It's now been proven beyond any challenge that Building 7 was a controlled demolition because you could measure the rate at which it fell, and it fell at free fall acceleration. That is only possible with controlled demolition, which removes all support below the levels above before the debris reaches, so that there's not even a split second of resistance. These things are all now known and established. But, and the recent polls show that half of the United States population no longer believes the official report, or at least has suspicions and doubts about it. But the story will never get out. There's no way to get the story out. The only way the story can get out is if the government steps forward and reveals it. That will never happen.
Well, in the case as well with Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, where we had the court case that it couldn't go any further because the government would have to incriminate itself, and they obviously won't do such a thing.
The civil court case established that Martin Luther King was not killed by the fall guy. That was the result of the civil case, that the government's explanation was false. They did establish that. Now, that didn't prove who did it, but it did prove that the government's case was false. Now, what we have coming up in 3 days is the 50th anniversary of President John F. Kennedy's assassination. And again, we've had 50 years of research by historians, and they have concluded unequivocally that the official story is false. But the government will never acknowledge what actually happened. And so, in order to know, you have to have the time and the energy to go through the extensive research by numerous authors, researchers, and to arrive at your own conclusion. And most people simply haven't got that kind of time or interest. And so the prevailing story prevails.
Okay, to switch to the economy and to see, do any students have questions at the moment? Yeah? Okay, World War III? Yeah? Okay, we'll get there in a second. On the economy, you mentioned, and as you sow, so shall you reap. The U.S., your prediction of the U.S. becoming a third world economy. Myself, I'm a U.S. citizen, and I frequently go into the U.S. to visit. And I do really see a gradual decline of the economy, and I hear stories from people that I know. But we have some students here that it was kind of a shock to hear you say third world economy. Can you give a definition or paint us a picture, a conservative picture of what you mean perhaps by third world economy?
Well, the easiest way to do this is to look at the character of the labor force in the third world economy. It is a labor force that's employed in lowly paid domestic services that do not produce tradable services or tradable goods. And such economies generally have large trade deficits because they produce domestic services which can't be exported, and the things they need have to be imported. They have to import the tradable professional skills and the manufactured goods. And if you look at the United States, that's precisely what its trade balance shows, and that is precisely what its labor force shows. Almost every month for a decade, maybe longer, I have reported on the monthly payroll job statistics report issued by the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the United States Department of Labor. Every month, for as long as I can remember, the only jobs created are in lowly paid domestic services, dominated by waitresses and bartenders, retail clerks, hospital orderlies, and social services. Your students can check this for themselves. Just go to Google and put BLS, and up will come their page, and look for the monthly payroll jobs report. And you can actually get these reports in 10-year segments, so you can compare any year with another year 10 years later, and you will see that there are no first world jobs being created in the United States. It's been like this, as I say, as long as I can remember. And all of my columns have reported this. So that is, I think, the easiest way to establish the point. And if you want further evidence, then just go look at the trade deficit. Look at what the United States imports and what it exports. It imports high technology products, manufactured products. What does it export? Scrap metal, agricultural commodities. I mean, it has exactly the portrait of a third world country that gets aid from the IMF and the World Bank. And so how much longer before the United States is being supported by the IMF and the World Bank? Who knows? Probably not very long.
We're very familiar with your analysis on, the de-Americanization of the world. BRICS are creating a rival to the IMF. They're talking about creating their own version of the internet, and everyone from Australia to Oman and even Hong Kong discussing removing the U.S. dollar peg. Uh, could we compare Pax Americana's fate to that of Pax Britannica? How comparable are the two? Because it seems the stakes are much higher for America, since it's the first time in the history of the world we've had such a debt, and where literally this global power can reach any coordinate on the planet militarily.
Well, I don't think. Well, look, I'm informed on these subjects, but I'm not an expert. And my impression is that American military power, I mean, despite the modern weapons, which of course are much more powerful than the weapons the British Empire had, regardless, it doesn't have the reach that the British Empire had. Secondly, the American empire was created differently. The British Empire came out of controlling trade routes, being the manufacturer of the world. The American empire has a different origin, and we don't have time for me to give my explanation of that. I think the difference also is that the British Empire collapsed under the impact of the First and Second World Wars, which bankrupted the country. And fortunately for the British, the Americans were there to pick up the burden for them. And the burden, of course, raised the power of the United States. But who is there in the West to pick up the burden from America? No one. It's no one. And what the Americans have done is not really destroy themselves in war, although the 21st century wars in the Middle East have done great damage to the public finances. what the American empire has done is to greatly abuse the role of the dollar as reserve currency and has been printing them in fantastic quantities. For example, for the last 5 years, they've been printing roughly $1,000 billion a year. But there's no demand for these dollars. The world is overflowing with dollars ever since World War II, when the United States took over the reserve currency role from Great Britain. And they're everywhere. And so everyone is holding these dollars and they're looking at the Federal Reserve dilute their holdings of dollars. You're printing 1,000 billion a year to keep the banks afloat, to finance the federal government, which cannot control or close its budget deficit. So at some point, people say, why are we continuing to hold these dollars when this amazing increase in supply is not met by an increase in demand? So it's got to affect the price or the exchange value. And so let's get out of them. And once that process starts, the United States loses control over economic policy. When the dollar declines, since the United States is now an import-dependent country, the internal prices, the domestic prices will rise sharply. The Americans will be faced with a huge domestic inflation. This inflation will further encourage foreigners to dump their dollars. So the great vulnerability of the United States is the huge supply of dollars in foreign hands. And if your economic policy is causing doubts to arise about the credibility of your currency, you're creating a situation where people say, let's leave the currency. And when they do that, that's the end of American power. It will no longer be able to pay its bills by printing its own money.
History shows us that empires don't go down without a fight, and this leads us to our last topic with Syria and war. For example, I read today in the news that there's a new U.S.-Afghan agreement to continue funding indefinitely, troops. So it doesn't seem like we're going to be leaving anytime soon. And we have a question here from a student.
Hello, Dr. Roberts.
Hello.
I was watching this interview of you on the American television, and I was wondering, well, you basically said that in the current juncture, the American government should be on the side of Bashar al-Assad regime in the fight against terrorism in Syria. But my question for you is that if you consider that the government should be right next to Assad's side, even though he's responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people during the Arab Spring, and of course the displacement of another huge quantity of people who had to leave his own country because of the civil war that started from the Arab Spring.
Well, what is the question precisely?
That if you consider that, is it right to be by Assad's side?
Well,
he was.
Okay, I see. Well, I don't know what interview with me you saw where I said this. My view is that the trouble in Syria was created by the United States, which, through its Middle Eastern puppet states, particularly the oil kingdoms, the various oil emirates and Saudi Arabia, armed outsiders, the same outsiders that the United States used in Libya against Gaddafi, to show up in Syria and start this so-called revolt or whatever. It's never been called an Arab Spring that I know of, not the Syrian. So the United States was behind this from the beginning. It wouldn't have happened without the United States instigating it. Now, they hid behind their Middle Eastern puppets. So the people fighting Assad are the extreme Islamicists who want to get rid of secular Muslim governments and impose Islamist law, Islamist government. It is proven beyond all doubt, and is openly admitted in Washington, that the strongest component of the so-called rebels in Syria is Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda related groups. So that the United States is now in the very curious position of supporting the alleged terrorist group that it's been fighting for 12 years. Now, my view of this is that it has nothing whatsoever to do with the United States. The United States should not be involved at all. It shouldn't be on anybody's side. It should not have initiated this conflict in an effort to overthrow a secular government that refused to be an American puppet state. So my view is that it has nothing to do with the United States. And if the United States had stayed out of it and not involved, the problem wouldn't be there in the first place. So in the Middle East, the United States has been very active in destroying the secular rulers who suppress the Islamicist terrorist elements. Saddam Hussein was a secular leader. Libya was essentially a secular state. Syria is a secular state. These are quite different from the Iranian state, which is a religious state, but still not a state that the United States has any business interfering with. So my view of this is that these interferences by Washington in the Middle East reflect the neoconservative ideology of American hegemony. It's a rebirth of the Jacobinism, the Jacobinism of the French Revolution, that we are going to take our revolution to all of Europe. And that's what the neoconservatives concluded from the collapse of the Soviet Union, that there is no longer any obstacle to America imposing its system on the world, and that it's our duty as the indispensable people, the exceptional people, to impose the American way on the rest of the world. And that's the reason for all of the turmoil in the Middle East. It's not an Arab Spring. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, we did indeed talk about General Wesley Clark's confirmation of the 7 countries in 5 years, and things seem to be going according to plan. So to lead to the final question, which where you discussed in previous articles a World War III scenario, something Professor Michel Chossudovsky out in Montreal has written a book about. Do you see this really going forward toward this end game scenario the U.S. has planned with Syria and Iran, and Russia and China? I mean, it's hard to fathom, but the way things have been going so far, it just leads one to a logical conclusion.
Well, that is the neoconservative ideology. That's their push. When I was in the government, they were just coming along, the neoconservatives. And when Reagan succeeded in ending the Cold War with the Soviet Union, the neoconservatives were angry because they didn't want to end it. They wanted to win it. They didn't want it to end from a diplomatic negotiation. They wanted a war in which the United States defeated the Soviet Union. That's their mentality. Now, my view is that looking at the world's blocking of American militarism in Syria, we saw that the Russian President Putin, using diplomacy, adroitly blocked the American attack. We saw that the British Parliament refused to participate. Now, this is an amazing thing for Britain, which is an American puppet state. And the British Parliament refused on the grounds that we are not going to provide cover again for yet another American war crime. The UN refused, and the American Congress and the American people refused. So we see that in Syria, the lies that Obama told, that the Secretary of State Kerry told, were ineffectual. They were disbelieved. And the rest of the world said no. And there was nothing America could do about it. And now we see that the Americans have been forced, by Americans, I mean Washington, of course, which is a different thing. Washington has been forced to finally enter into negotiations with Iran about Washington's trumped up charges of nuclear weapons. And that this is forcing Washington to resolve that situation. So we may see, if the rest of the world holds to its resolve, that Washington has to back down off this agenda of using militarism and war to advance American hegemony. We see that Washington has surrounded Russia with military bases, violating every agreement that President Reagan made with Gorbachev. We see that Washington has now declared its pivot to Asia policy, where it's going to reallocate its fleet from the Persian Gulf to China to be able to control the sea lanes that China uses to provide itself with raw materials and trade. So that this aggressiveness has moved from small countries, which couldn't resist, to the other two nuclear armed countries that can resist. Now, I think that this move will also be blocked, and that the people in Washington will have to back off, just as they had to back off in Syria. And so it's not without hope that American militarism can be put back in the bottle, constrained, and closed down, particularly given the suffering of the American people economically, the inability of the economy to produce any growth in real median family income for decades. The economy is really, there's no economy here. Recently, Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, spoke at the IMF annual conference and said that the growth of the United States was far below the potential GDP growth rate, that the amount of people employed were less than prior to the financial crisis, and that the percentage of the population employed was the same today as at the nadir of that crisis, so that we've made no progress. So I think as these hardships come home more and more to more Americans, it will shift the attention of Washington from its foreign adventures to dealing with its serious internal economic problems.
And can you leave the students with a piece of advice? A number of them seem to have become slightly pessimistic or cynical after learning about a lot of these things. But I think that's something that needs to happen. So when they graduate and go out into the world, they can be more effective, where they know where the real problems lie, and they can deal with the real problems.
If they want to know anything, they have to pay close attention and study. They cannot believe governments. They cannot believe the media, because the media, certainly in America, is a handmaiden to the government. It simply reads government press releases. That's all it does. So if they want to be informed, they have to be cynical. There's no way around it. You can't believe anything the United States government says about any subject. You can't believe the inflation numbers, the unemployment numbers. You can't believe weapons of mass destruction. You can't believe Iranian nukes. You can't believe Syrian gas attacks. Anything they say serves an undeclared agenda. But you can still learn. You can still know what's going on. And so I encourage them never to quit, never to give up. And I think that in the end, and sometimes it's too long, it takes too long, but in the end, truth tends to prevail. For example, today, half the American population does not believe the official story of 9/11. But the official story is still there. It's just not believed. More than half of the population does not believe the official story of John F. Kennedy's assassination. But the official story is still there. It's just not believed. So I think that what happens is that governments that don't tell the truth just become discredited, and people cease to believe them and go about their business.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Roberts. We thank you for your books, your insightful articles, and for your time.
Well, thank you for sharing your class with me. It's very encouraging to me that people are paying this kind of attention, especially abroad.
Sure. Thanks a lot, and keep up the good work. And we'll stay tuned to your website. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.